Hello and welcome to another video. This time I am going into the biological explanations of addictive behaviour. So to give a bit of an overview, with an addictive behaviour question you could be asked to describe and evaluate two different explanations. So you have your 10-mark biological explanation of the role of dopamine, and then your 5-mark biological explanation could be genes. So this could be, it could ask you about both of them in one as a 10 or 15 marker. It could just ask about one, it could just ask about the other. As long as you know them two, you'll be okay. But then also, you can discuss, it might ask how you modify your biology in addictive behaviour, and that would be through the use of antagonist drugs. So going on to explanation one, so these biological explanations are quite in-depth. There's a lot of terminology that you have to get your head around. So I'm hoping that these slides kind of give a bit of an overview. If you want to do some extra reading around what each one means, you can always do that. However, this is sort of the simplest format that I could possibly do whilst it's still making sense. So you're going to see this diagram a lot throughout the slides, and this shows all the different pathways. So for explanation one, the role of dopamine, it says that there are 4 total pathways in the brain. However, the 3 on the screen are the ones that link to addictive behaviour. You have the mesocortical, the mesolimbic, and the negostriatal. So in order to understand what dopamine is, I've got an explanation here. It's a neurotransmitter that plays a significant role in the reward, motivation, habits, movement, and attention. Therefore, it can be linked to addictive behaviour, and you'll soon see why. So dopamine is carried along chains of neurons, and they stimulate certain areas of the brain within these pathways. So if there's an increase of dopamine in the pathways, we're going to feel more reward and pleasure. Whereas if there's a decrease, then individuals can experience low mood and issues with movement. So these are sort of explained in the next couple of slides, where I'm going to go into each different pathway and explain how they apply to addictive behaviour, and sort of it goes into how we initiate it, how we become addicted ourselves, and then what happens when we have withdrawal symptoms. So in the mesolimbic pathway, this pathway, the red one here, so the text matches the colour on the image, it's linked to your pleasure and reward system. So right in the middle of the brain where all 3 stem from, that's known as the VTA, the ventral tegmental area, and it ends at the nucleus accumbens, so where the arrow points to. However, this pathway can become maladaptive, meaning in addicts can become more harmful than helpful. So if we do an everyday activity, say we go on a run every day and we feel that sort of pleasure and accomplishment, that's our mesolimbic pathway rewarding us. However, with addicts, they're being rewarded for undesirable behaviour, so that's where it's maladaptive, because it's harming the addicts because they want to feel that pleasure more. So here, when first engaging with substances that can cause addiction, neurons are activated in the VTA, where they fire dopamine to D2, which is dopamine receptors, and the nucleus accumbens. Dopamine then will bind to these D2 receptors and stimulate them, and that stimulation is what makes us feel euphoric and pleasure. And an addiction can then be initiated as the individual will repeat this behaviour, hoping to experience them same feelings. So this can be linked to the characteristic of mood modification, because when we might engage in addictive behaviour, we might feel a high or a buzz, and that's our D2 receptors been stimulated. So then, carrying on with this, we then build a tolerance. So this is where addicts, they need more of their addictive behaviour to feel pleasure. And the best way to explain this is with a diagram. So an addict has increased levels of dopamine compared to a non-addict because they're constantly engaging, dopamine has constantly been fired. So this green line on the top is a non-addict. That's the normal transmission of dopamine. However, before tolerance is built, an addict gets more, they stimulate more, but then after a tolerance is built, they need even more. So you can see it's just repetitive and constant. And if our D2 receptors are constantly been overstimulated, like if you're constantly been overworked and stressed, you're going to get tired. Whereas these D2 receptors get tired, but in biological terms, they will lose their sensitivity and wear away. So that's known as desensitization. So as there is a decrease in these D2 receptors, because they're all desensitized, the effects of the substance and behavior is reduced. So they get less of a buzz or a high. So they need more and more and more to try and stimulate what receptors they do actually have left. And then we come to where an addict will sort of recognize and realize that maybe they are addicted and they need help. So this is when they try and achieve abstinence. So this is when they stop engaging in their addictive behavior. And then it will be often that they have withdrawal symptoms. So activity along the dopamine pathways are less than pre-addictive behavior levels, because as you can see, they've both got normal transmission here. The green and the pink line, they're normal. However, the nucleus accumbens, where the D2 receptors are, for a non-addict, they're very strong. So that's okay. You feel your normal sense of pleasure. But in an addict, the nucleus accumbens is now weak because of all the dopamine that's been fired, and they've now desensitized. So here, this affects areas of the brain and its functioning, which causes unpleasant withdrawal symptoms. And to relieve these symptoms, they then begin to engage in addictive behaviour to increase levels of dopamine, to feel that feeling of pleasure and not drowsiness and sickness and nausea. So the mesolimbic pathway is all to do with how we initiate, how we sustain, but then also why we have withdrawal symptoms and why a lot of addicts will relapse. So then the next pathway to consider is the mesocortical pathway. So this is the one that links to the, sorry, my headphones went off and it was a pain to get them reconnected. So the mesolimbic pathway is associated with our memory and attention. As you can see, it wraps around the whole brain. It begins at the VTA, like all the other pathways, and as I said, it goes around the prefrontal cortex. So as you can see, frontal, it's mainly the frontal lobe. And the changes in the prefrontal cortex through this dopamine activity is what it turns engaging in behaviour into actually becoming addicted to it. So salience, this is a characteristic of addictive behaviour where the sort of it will become everything to that person. That addict, everything that is important to them is the addictive behaviour. Their attention, everything is focused on that addictive behaviour. So repeated use in addictive behaviour changes the signals we receive in our prefrontal cortex. And because we're receiving that signal all the time, the brain thinks, well, this is important. So it places more significance on that addictive behaviour and any cues associated with it. So for example, an alcohol addict might walk down the street and they'll see some guys laughing outside who might appear drunk, and then that could sort of trigger a little bit of dopamine, thinking, oh, I would like a drink right now. Or even if they walk past a bar, they might think, oh, yeah, I want to go in and want to get a drink. And this sort of change in our brain is known as brain plasticity. So it's like plasticine, you can mould it, you can sculpt it. And this is the whole idea, our brain can change based on what importance and significance we have in our life at that time. So this is where we can sort of see where people will say it makes individuals want to engage in addictive behaviour, like more need, that they have to do it. Rather than them actually enjoying it, they have to do it. So here I've put, this makes individuals need/want to engage in addictive behaviour rather than them actually enjoying it, as they no longer like the experience, but the changes in the brain has created the impulses where they just have to do it and they can't stop. So this is the sort of moments where people will say, oh, I wanted to, but I just couldn't. So that's the mesocortical pathway. Now, this last pathway I'm going to introduce, a few sentences or two will help. It's very short, so if you could fit it in, that'd be great. It'd boost your answer. So this is the nigrostriatal pathway. This is what's associated with forming habits. So as I said, it begins at the VTA and it ends at the dorsal striatum. Now this is where habits are formed when we are stimulated. So if we're constantly, it's sort of like the mesocortical pathway. If we're constantly engaging in that addictive behaviour, our brain's going to identify patterns, identify maybe that we do it on a night or we do it at a certain time, you know what I mean? Like the time distance or between when we do it. This means that the addict can then anticipate the addictive behaviour in the future, even when they're not engaging in it. So someone who smokes might think, "Oh, I can't wait for my break, so I can have a smoke," or they might think, an alcohol addict might think, "Oh, I can't wait to get home tonight and open a bottle of wine," or something like that. So that was all the explanation one. That was a lot of information and it can be a lot to process. However, I do post my slides on my TikTok, so you can sort of scroll them, screenshot them, do it at your own pace. Do some mind maps if you need to, print out some diagrams and annotate them. Anything that can help you get that in will be great. So the second explanation is genes. So it states that addictive behaviour is inherited, so it runs in family, and we found several genes that have been linked to addictive behaviour. So the first gene is DRD2 gene, and this is responsible for levels of dopamine in the brain. So the D2A1 variant of this gene links to addictive behaviour as it can result in individuals having fewer D2 receptors in the nucleus accumbens. So I'll let you figure that out yourself, have a little guess which pathway that is, the nucleus accumbens. But this means they don't experience as much pleasure from rewarding activities because there's less receptors to receive that dopamine. So it's harder to feel that sense of happiness and pleasure. So then they'll overcompensate by engaging in addictive behaviour because that, in their eyes, is the best way to give constant stimulation. So this is similar where they will overstimulate the receptors they do have, so therefore they become desensitised, and from there they can build a tolerance to it. There's a study here to show how the variant varies between like addicts and non-addicts. So Cummings et al., he found that 48.7% of smokers compared to 25.9% of non-smokers had the D2A1 variant. And then he also found that 50.9% of gamblers compared to that 25.9% of non-gamblers also had the D2A1 variant. So in both of these examples, the addicts had higher levels, higher amounts of this D2A1 variant. And then continuing, the next gene, this is a little bit more difficult to get your head around. However, if you use the diagram, it can help you. It's the ADH and the ALDH gene, which is responsible for helping the body metabolize alcohol. So everyone has these genes. It helps you. So when anyone has alcohol, this is what's going on inside your body at the time. So ADH is known as alcohol dehydrogenase, and ALDH is aldehyde dehydrogenase. I don't think you need to know the exact phrase. However, it does help if you add it in. It can make your answer stand out a little bit more, seem a bit more professional. So ADH, as on this diagram, breaks alcohol down into acetaldehyde. Now, acetaldehyde is a toxin. So when this toxin is in our body and broken down, this is what causes the unpleasant side effects that when we drink alcohol, such as feeling sick or feeling dizzy. But then the ALDH will further break the acetaldehyde down into water and acid. So then that's when our feelings of sickness sort of stop, is because the ALDH has come in and broken that down further for us. But research has shown that certain variants of these genes can influence the likelihood of alcohol addictions. And there's a specific variant called ADH1B, and this increases the risk as there's no buildup of the acetaldehyde. So if there's no buildup, they don't get any of these unpleasant side effects that make someone want to stop drinking. So therefore, this individual can drink more and more alcohol without feeling the symptoms. And then because they're constantly engaged in getting the firing of dopamine, they can then become addictive. So that's the explanation 2 of genes. That's also a bit to get your head around. Just the main thing to consider is that there are 2 different genes. You discuss what they do in the body in general, and then you will say what variants they are that have been linked to addictive behaviour and how these cause addictive behaviour. So finally, we need to discuss the method of modifying, which is the use of drugs. So this is based on the role of dopamine, and it suggests that, as we said before, addictive behaviour is caused by an increase in dopamine. So when dopamine is released, they'll experience feelings of pleasure or euphoria. So when you write in these method of modifying questions, you sort of state what the assumption is. The explanation, and say how it links to addictive behaviour, why it causes addictive behaviour. So just a couple of sentences explaining, outlining that. So then the examiner can understand how this method of modifying works. So we say here, to modify, dopamine levels need to be manipulated. So this is done through the use of antagonist drugs that control the level of dopamine being released. So an example we would put in is naltrexone. So antagonist drugs, they block D2 receptors, so opioid receptors, which are what's known to causing addictions. So if they block, so if you can imagine we have like a little hole, and that's our receptor, and then we get like a block and it fills the hole, that is what the antagonist drugs will do. And this will reduce the amount of dopamine being released because it can't get out. It can't fix on and stimulate the D2 receptors. So it'll stop us feeling any sense of pleasure or euphoria when engaging. So if they don't feel this pleasure that they once felt when they started their addictive behaviour, it will reduce their usage and can help achieve abstinence. Obviously, they might experience the withdrawal symptoms, and through the other use of different drugs, that can help sort of calm down and stop this, stop the feelings to help them achieve abstinence further. So that's the method of modifying, using antagonist drugs. So make sure you don't get mixed up between agonist and antagonist, because they do 2 different things. And an agonist will rapidly dissociate after a period of time, but antagonist drugs do not. So that's my video. Sorry it was very quick, but as I said, the slides will be on TikTok. So to recap, I've gone over the 10-mark biological explanation, which is the role of dopamine. That's the lengthy one about the pathways. That's why it's at 10 marks. And then you have the 5-mark biological explanation of the genes, and then your 5-mark modification, which is your description only. So I haven't gone through the evaluation of the 2 explanations, because I think you can sort of teachers kind of give students different points and things like that. However, if you'd like a few evaluation points, please put it in the comments and I'll happily post a few like prompts to help you think of your own, because an examiner would love it if they see you come up with an evaluation point it has to be obviously correct, and it would be great to have a piece of research. But if you can think of your own sort of starting points and do further research and add them in, your answer will stand out to an examiner. So whatever you can do to be sort of pushing yourself a little bit further, but you don't have to do that if you're just achieving like a C or a B, but for A and A stars, to set yourself apart and really achieve that A star, maybe do some wider reading. But that's it for my video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you later.